So good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. It is absolutely wonderful to see so many people here for this fantastic event. I think many of you may know me, but just to say it one more time, my name is Bridget Terry Long, and I am very, very proud to be the Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. So welcome. I'm delighted today that we have this important event focused on the impacts of environmental change on early childhood development. 2023 made headlines as the hottest year on record, with global temperatures averaging 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial levels. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but it impacted people all over the world, including children right here in the United States. Along the East Coast, students were forced to stay inside while wildfire smoke from Canada made the air dangerous to breathe. In Phoenix, kids were unable to go out on the playground in the middle of the day, with temperatures exceeding 110 degrees for 54 days in a row. In Texas, student sports schedules had to be adjusted to avoid the heat, and schools in Chicago, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Detroit, Milwaukee, and many other cities had to be closed because of heat days, and it was just too hot to learn. And in New York City, a rainstorm caused more than 150 schools to flood, following similar tragedies in Los Angeles. Now, in spring of last year, the Environmental Protection Agency released a report documenting the extensive effects of the heat, air pollution, and flooding, the impacts it will have on our children. Among the effects, the trends we are seeing with climate will increase the prevalence of asthma, food insecurity, and stressful experiences for both children and their caregivers. There will be undeniable negative effects on student learning, with the impacts being most severe for children of color and children living in poverty. Important for our focus today, these climate-related effects are most likely to affect the health and development of the youngest children from the prenatal period through early childhood, given these are sensitive periods of development. So yes, we are living in a changing climate, and this is not some future challenge, it's here now. Education leaders must increasingly grapple with how to best support learners, schools, and communities. And we know that education leaders can advance solutions and enable children, learners, and families across the globe to thrive in this changing world. And that's why so many of us are here. With this conversation today, entitled A Healthy Childhood in a Changing Climate, we have the opportunity to highlight the ways in which our changing climate is impacting the health, learning, and development of our youngest learners, but also importantly, what we can do to promote healthy development for young children in the midst of this changing climate. I'm very, very excited that we have with us this evening a prominent expert in public health and early childhood development who's going to help us lead this conversation, and that is Chelsea Clinton. So Chelsea, if I may, holds a DPhil in International Relations and a Master's in Public Health. She serves as Vice Chair of the Clinton Foundation, Vice Chair of the Clinton Health Access Initiative, and chairs the Clinton Foundation's early childhood initiative called Too Small to Fail, which supports families with the resources they need to promote early brain and language development. Thank you so much, Chelsea, for joining us today. And if you'll join me up on stage. Okay. So welcome again. For those of you who were not in the green room earlier with us, we were all comparing stories about our kids and their various developments and how much more they know about climate change than many of us. And they know how important it is. But to kick us off, Chelsea, with climate change for so many of us, our moment when we realized we really have to do something about this might be tied to our children. Or I was telling you earlier about a friend who works in this area. And my moment was when he said, Disney World is going to have to be closed probably about 100 days out of the year because it's going to be too hot. I'm wondering for you, what was your moment that made you look at this issue differently and devote your time and energy to it?
Yeah, well, I want to say thank you, Dean Long, to you and to everyone here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and to everyone kind of with the Ask With Education Forum. Having been on the other side of planning events like this, I know that the smoother they run, the more work has gone into them. So really just, Dean Long, want to thank you and Marketa and your whole team and everyone who has brought us here together this evening for this vital and urgent and important, but hopefully also optimistic conversation. So when I was a little kid, I was very concerned about pollution and acid rain. I grew up in the 1980s, and acid rain was sort of the galvanizing kind of conversation around climate, I think, for kids, and also pollution and helping kind of clean up trash and recycle wherever we could. So I read this book called 50 Simple Things Kids Can Do to Save the World. And I became an evangelist. And my parents thankfully supported me as I, my first experiment I ever ran was I had different colors of construction paper. And I would kind of put signs about where to recycle on them, and I would try to see, would people respond better to blue or green? Yes, thank you for those of you who laughed. And I think empathy, and maybe even a little bit of kind of similar stories being remembered from your own lives. And that kind of started kind of my curiosity about kind of what do we do to this place that we call home, and how can we be better stewards of it. And yet, for most of my kind of professional life, as an academic, as an advocate, kind of with the Clinton Foundation, I was more focused on kind of what we conventionally think of as public health, and particularly global public health. And then I became a parent. And admittedly, everything that I already cared about, I became even more kind of intensely focused on, and kind of a sense of kind of greater responsibility to do kind of anything and everything that I could. And I started to care about climate, not just as a citizen and as a voter, as a consumer, but as an advocate and an activist, because all of a sudden, it very much felt like, how could I not? How could I not do whatever I could with my heart and my brains and my resources and my networks and my platform to try to draw attention to kind of, yes, the harrowing challenges that climate change kind of already creates for people, particularly our most vulnerable, but also then to try to help, which is why I'm so grateful to be here with kind of the next panel, to focus on what we can do. Because I do think it is quite easy for people to feel overwhelmed, understandably. The scale is overwhelming. But then for that kind of sense of overwhelming to kind of slip into inertia and to slip into cynicism. And I think that cynicism is actually, a great resource for the people who want to protect the status quo. And I think as we think about climate change, we certainly cannot be protecting the status quo. And so I am so thankful, again, to be here, to be focused on what we know works, to help hopefully attract kind of more resources, more attention kind of to those solutions, so that we are kind of always kind of building in a more sustainable way.
It's wonderful. So again, you've come to a place where we try to create hope. Because there's amazing work that's going on out there, and together we can do so much. So you mentioned earlier that you've focused on public health issues for many years, but with Too Small to Fail, the work you've done with the Clinton Foundation, you focused on promoting early brain and language development. Why did you make that choice to focus on the youngest of our littlest learners?
So I'm sure you're aware of my mom's focus on early childhood education, probably Dean Long. And I grew up understanding how important it was that we surround children and our kind of caregivers with the resources that every child deserves to grow up in a language-rich environment. I remember learning how to read as a kid and how excited my parents were, and I remember my parents always kind of taking me to the book drives at our church or our school or local Y, and kind of always prioritizing helping kind of more books reach more kids in more places in our hometown of Little Rock, Arkansas. And so in 2013, as we were thinking about kind of what should the next kind of focal area of work be for the foundation, and my mom had just stepped down as Secretary of State and was thinking kind of where she wanted to kind of first dig in, it just seemed obvious that we should start on kind of early childhood education. And so, now reflecting back over the last decade of work, I don't think we could have foreseen exactly where that work would have taken us. So, as one example, particularly pertinent to this conversation, we developed with a playground manufacturer kind of playground structures that have kind of early reading and math prompts on them, but also have shade. And now there are more than 1,300 of the Too Small to Fail playground structures in playgrounds in schools, kind of early childhood centers, public parks around the country. So with prompts like, how many colors do you see? How many shapes do you see? How many times can you swing on the swing? Things that might seem obvious, but hopefully only seem obvious because we are lucky enough to be sitting in a conversation here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I don't think are always obvious to parents and grandparents or aunts or uncles or older siblings of little kids. We've also helped build now hundreds of libraries and laundromats because low-income families spend on average 2 to 4 hours a week in Coin laundromats, and we've had a great partnership with the Coin Laundromat Association where we kind of piloted a few libraries and laundromats, and then thankfully after a good bit of kind of academic evaluation had shown that the kind of active talking and teaching and interaction time had gone up many times in laundromats after kind of the library intervention, and importantly that parents felt better about their own parenting skills because now they had something to do with their kids while they were waiting for the wash. Something that is deeply meaningful to me is we've partnered with family courts in Wisconsin to turn waiting rooms in family courts into bright, kind of happy play and reading spaces for kids and families at a moment of intense stress for kids and families. And we just kind of launched a partnership with the Department of Social Services in California to turn social services waiting rooms also into kind of bright, happy, kind of reading and play spaces for kids. We work with WIC clinics, grocery stores, transportation authorities. One of the cooler things I got to do in this work was to see all the buses around Philadelphia with our messaging on them and to get on the bus. But I was like, I get a little car sick, so I was like trying to read them. And I was like, I'm not the person who's meant for these, but I'm very proud of them. And so D-Long, it's really trying to meet parents and caregivers and all the places and spaces we spend time to resource parents and caregivers in the way that I would hope any of us would want for every child to have at every point of their lives.
Absolutely. So that is really an incredible list of things that you've done, meeting people where they are, and even doing the research to prove that it's effective and it works.
I think we're up to 16 studies now. I think 16. I'm looking at Patty. Yes, 16. Not with you yet, but maybe next.
But we can always sing about the evidence, and I think we all have to work together to continue to implement what does work. But I'm curious, there's a number of things you've discussed about early development, early literacy, but what made you think about the intersection of early development and climate change?
Well, the evidence, right? I mean, Dean Long, as you were saying in your introductory remarks, if we think about kind of any dimension of kind of how we understand climate change, whether we're thinking about the extreme heat that you spoke about, pollution, the ways in which extreme heat and pollution interact, all of that is particularly dangerous for our most vulnerable, and certainly our young children are among our most vulnerable. And so, again, I think because we've worked in partnership with so many different kind of people and organizations kind of in the ecosystem that surround small children and their families, we thought, well, how do we think about kind of helping parents understand the effects of climate change on their kids, but also kind of what they can be doing to better protect their kids and to build resilience. And so we kind of very much have been in a posture of kind of learning and listening, but also kind of activation and acting. And one of the ways that we've been focused that I didn't talk about yet is we kind of, with funding, thankfully, from the Rockefeller Foundation, have developed a kind of toolkit for storytellers and content creators, because we know how powerful storytelling is directly to children and also to parents. And so we've worked with kind of creators in Hollywood and kind of online and everywhere where parents spend time with kind of parent influencers and parent magazines and parent blogs on other challenges and topics related to early kind of brain development, but not yet on climate. And so we hope that kind of the toolkit, which will be rolled out in a few months, will really help content creators who care about whether climate or early childhood or both kind of figure out how to weave in those messages kind of into their programs, whether it's a program on YouTube or it's a program kind of on primetime television or kind of a story that's being written about something else, because we know how important it is that we have atmospheric messaging to help kind of reach as many people as possible with kind of the real understanding of, again, both the threat but also kind of the responses that parents can activate in their own lives to help protect their and our kids.
Yes, absolutely. I really want to underscore the focus on getting parents involved. Too often in interventions and solutions, we don't include the parents. And also vitally important, something that we've pushed for here at the Ed School, is what an important lever schools, families, educators are when we're combating issues of climate change and trying to educate and prepare for better solutions.
Well, and we know, Dean Long, which I'm sure you know even more than I do, we know that, actually particularly people who are grandparents are quite informed and even persuaded by their kids. So if you look at voting patterns, if you kind of look at surveys of kind of voter data for people 65 and older who are grandparents, if they say, that they kind of care about climate, either as kind of the first thing they're voting on or kind of within the aperture of things that, they're voting at least partly because of, they'll often say like they really learned about climate change or they understood it was important because of their grandkids. And so it is so hugely important, of course, that we kind of teach kids about kind of the science of the world around us. That's what helps kind of fuel their curiosity and their creativity, and also to build them as citizens. Because I think it is really important, again, when we think about kind of these big, scary, kind of all this stuff happening in our world, to help kids feel like they can still make a difference. For me, it was the construction paper. But for kids today, of course, it is still recycling, but also helping educate their own family members about kind of the fact that the climate is changing and what can we do, and also why voting matters.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I don't want to take too much more time because we have an outstanding panel that's going to start in a moment. But for my last question, we've noted just how challenging this is and some of the hard truths that we have to face in this work. But I wonder, what brings you the most hope and optimism as you look ahead?
Oh, goodness. Well, certainly getting to work with people like Patty and our extraordinary team at Too Small to Fail that is constantly, thinking about what more we can be doing to better support parents and caregivers. I said earlier, slightly jokingly, but 100% serious, like I couldn't have imagined all the spaces and places where we would be, laundromats and WIC clinics and family courts and bus stops and churches and grocery stores and playgrounds. And yet now, of course, retrospectively, it all seems like, well, that's exactly where we should be. And it also hopefully is still just the beginning. And so what gives me optimism are being in places and spaces like this with all of you, right? I'm sure you had many options of things that you could do tonight. You didn't have to be here. Well, maybe some of the students had to be here, but the rest of you didn't have to be here. And that we have more people understanding why it is so important that we better understand the effects of climate change, extreme heat, shifting weather patterns, how the changes to our food system, and kind of everything that we think of in the climate conversation has to also be in the early childhood conversation, that these cannot be kind of separate conversations or kind of separate spheres of work or research or kind of solution making and activating. And it makes me incredibly optimistic that there are so many people who spend even more time than I do thinking again about how scary climate change is, who refuse to be cynical. And so I do think, wow, like if the people who are like at the frontier of the research, at the frontier of trying to, better help protect pregnant people and babies and small children and our elderly and kind of people with conditions who are especially vulnerable to climate change, if they're not getting discouraged, if they're getting up every day and doing their work and they're in a posture of like learning and questioning about what more we can and therefore like normatively should be doing, like I don't get to be anything but optimistic. Like I have to be in well, what can I do? How can I be a more effective and efficient and a better supporter and champion and advocate and student in service of all of that to hopefully just create then more optimism that more people feel like, yes, it is scary. And either we can be scared, like put the covers, either proverbially or actually, like over our heads, or we can think, how extraordinary is it that we live in a time where so many people are trying to figure out how to save our planet, and to think, well, what can we do to be part of that? And so I choose what I believe is the more kind of moral but happier and healthier place to be optimistic, because I just think, like, how lucky am I to be alive at a time when we have so many people doing such extraordinary work to truly save the world. That's pretty awesome.
That is absolutely awesome. And I just want to point out for the audience, just look around at how many people are here. And I know when I first walked in, just the look of encouragement that we're all here together. Again, you didn't have to be here. And we've had several events about the intersection of education and climate change, and they've all been incredibly well attended. So I take your optimism, but I also invite you to be optimistic as you look at who is around you and who is showing up for this important discussion. So Chelsea, thank you so much. I said I could take up the whole hour and a half, but I will not, because we have a fantastic panel that I'm going to introduce right now. So I want to invite our amazing panel up in just a moment. To introduce them just briefly, we have Leah Austin, President and CEO of the National Black Child Development Institute. Gaurav Basu, who's the Director of Education and Policy at the Center for Climate, Health, and the Global Environment at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. so our colleague from not too far away. And increasingly, we're doing more and more with the School of Public Health, so that's wonderful. We have Lindsay Burkhart, who's the Chief Science Officer at the Center on the Developing Child here at Harvard University, and very much a close friend of the Ed School. And then we have Junlei Lee, the Saul Zantz Senior Lecturer in Early Childhood Education here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. So please join me in welcoming them to the stage. And while we do this transition, please join me in thanking Jody Smith-Bennett, who is absolutely essential in putting this event together.
I just want to say really what a privilege and pleasure it is to be kind of on this stage and sharing this space and conversation with these extraordinary panelists, some of whom I've been lucky enough to know and work with for quite a while, and some of whom I was lucky enough to meet this evening and hope to be able to say in the future that I've been lucky enough to know and work with for a while. I want to start asking each of the panelists a question that Dean Long asked me, which is kind of how did each of you get involved in this work? Were you kind of kids thinking about kind of climate change and that led you to kind of the intersections of climate change and health? Were you thinking about health? Were you thinking about small kids? Did you become a parent and it galvanized you? How did you wind up on this stage is, I think, what I'm asking you. Lindsay, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks for having me, to you and Dean Long. As a child, I was really fortunate because my parents and some of my teachers, can you hear me? It's like a funny echo, kind of fostered this deep love of nature and the natural world. And then when I became a parent, I kind of identify very much with your experiences that it's amazing to see your children kind of develop that same love and to have that ability to go out and explore and be fortunate to have experiences in nature where they're developing curiosity and wonder and kind of this love of nature. But I had a moment a few years ago when my youngest son was in kindergarten, and at the time we were sort of noticing as parents that classrooms were changing, they were starting to feel warmer. We were kind of noticing this, teachers were noticing this, and he came home from school one day and said, and he goes to an amazing school where he has access to wonderful teachers and opportunities, but he said, it was so hot in my classroom today that my brain went to sleep. And I sort of had this moment of really coming to realize how climate change and how increasing temperatures were fundamentally altering the environment that was surrounding him and shaping his development. And we know that the environment that surrounds children and the experiences that they have in all of these places, right, where they live and learn and play and grow, together they shape children's development. And these developmental environments, I became to understand, are really being impacted by climate change. And I was seeing this as a pediatrician as well, seeing children with asthma and allergies affected more as days became hotter and the allergy season extended. And so, climate change is impacting these developmental environments, and I began to really feel that. But what really motivated me was that it also seemed like we already have this huge range of solutions that people have identified that are really good for early childhood, and they're really good for climate. So similar to your kind of closing remarks, like you have to feel optimistic and motivated because it feels like it's there, and we just need to kind of make it happen.
So we'll get to how we hopefully can make it happen.
Yeah, we will.
Yes, absolutely. But Leah, how did you kind of come to be so focused on early childhood and climate?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one, I'll say it did not start off as me as a child worrying or wondering way too much about my environment and climate, so I'll just be honest there. I'm probably newer to the issue of climate change than many of my colleagues, but I started my career off as an early childhood teacher and taught in DC public schools. And so I have for a very long time been really concerned about the quality of life that Black children, in particular, and Black children and families experience in the United States and even globally. And so when I became the president and CEO of the National Black Child Development Institute, as we were, and this was 2.5 years ago, as we were going through our strategic planning process, very exciting, yay, strategic planning. We were looking at data across a number of different factors and indicators, and unfortunately, just kind of being slapped in the face over and over again with where Black children were faring. And climate came up as one of those indicators, one of those factors, that Black children would in fact bear the brunt of the burden of climate change. And as that became more aware to us, we decided that it had to be, it wasn't even really a decision, it was kind of, we just had to, that climate change has to be an issue. So it's one of 8 outcomes that I'll talk about while we're on the panel, but it's just had to become one of the issues that we tried to tackle. And I will just add to that, I'm also a parent, so I have a 9-year-old son. I'm also an aunt, so I have niece and nephews. I am an aunt to sort of my extended village of friends, and just thinking about their kids who I love very deeply. And I'll say it keeps me up at night, which I think that turns into a motivating factor, to understand that, just the sadness that we live in a world where, quite frankly, Black children don't have the same access to clean air and clean water, for example, which is utterly ridiculous, but it is where we are, and it's the reason why we're on this panel and here to talk to you all, and it's obviously the reason you're here, is to understand, how do we change that? It's something that we can change, and so how do we change that?
Yeah, I did not grow up thinking about climate change very much. I'm a community primary care doctor. I think this core question has animated my inquiry growing up is, how do we make a world and we can take care of each other? How do we make a world? How do we put things in place so we can take care of each other? And so that led me to be a community primary care doc. That led me to work in Liberia and India and work on human rights and global health work. So I was working on child nutrition and diarrheal disease, reproductive health rights, and I was all around it, or it was all around me, and I couldn't see it. I remember talking to a friend saying, it's great you're planning a career in environmental work, but there's so many people we got to take care of. Like, I got to do that. And that was a misunderstanding on my part, clearly. In 2018, the UN had a big report, the IPCC report, which many of you probably know, and it just shook me. I mean, I can very clearly remember the morning. It was a Sunday morning, October 2018, and I was waking up, and I kind of pulled up the New York Times, and it had this dramatic finding of what climate change was doing to health. And my wife was pregnant at the time. My hand was shaking, and I gave her the phone, and it changed my life. It was a thunderbolt moment where I couldn't see it before, and then I saw it everywhere. I saw it impacting all the people, things, issues I loved and cared about, and I realized that in order to protect those things, we had to act with urgency and ambition to stop climate change. And so that really, I changed my career a lot in 2018. I really changed my focus and didn't change what I cared about, actually just integrated climate into all of those things. And there was a real process in that. I felt overwhelmed and daunted. I think that's the core story here. How do you go from despair to courage? When my family went to sleep at night, I'd keep the light on and kind of stay up till 2 a.m. and just studied and read and, realized that health and being a doctor and talking about it in those terms was exactly where I needed to be. And I think, I think we enter this space of a moral conversation about how we create a world in which we can better take care of each other, make a world worthy of our children. And I guess I say that because we are every single person in this room is very well positioned to be a leader in this work. Whatever it is that you do, whatever you care about, you are right there ready to make impact. And it takes some time. You need community, you need support. We are all in this together, but we need all of us together holding this thing.
Julie?
I think I'm here because of my deep appreciation for early childhood educators and how they've always engaged children in thinking about the environment to make sense of their relationship with the world. To prepare for this panel, I called 2 of my dear friends who are lifelong early childhood educators to ask them all these years, what is it that they have learned with and from children about what it means to build a relationship with the environment. And the other thing that I did, you might laugh, is I rewatched the 1990 week on environment from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So for those of you who didn't grow up with the program, it was the longest running children's program on public television. And long before we've grown-ups have started to talk about climate change, he devoted a whole week in 1990 about the environment. And it was during that week, Chelsea, you were talking, I think, earlier about one of your children loved marine biology. During that week, it culminated with Mr. Rogers diving into the ocean with the marine biologist Sylvia Earles on the boat, talking about what does it mean to care for the fish in the ocean and what does it mean to care for the planet. And it's out of that deep appreciation of the legacy of early childhood education and the environment that I'm here.
I mean, I'm going to cry.
I know. I want to talk more.
Well, I know. Well, I think we're all going to go home tonight, probably, and Google. Hopefully not at 2 a.m. You know, like Climate Week, Mr. Rogers, 1990, and hope that it's easy to find. I am also curious, Julie, what did your friends tell you that they've learned from their many years as early childhood educators, as how kids understand that there is a world beyond kind of their classroom or their home or wherever else they might be spending time?
So one of the first things my early childhood educator friend told me is that, children see the world so much lower than we do, which means that they see the things on the ground so much more clearly than we do. They are so fascinated with everything that is there. And that one of the things that my friend told me, it wasn't just about how much we need to teach children, but how much we can learn from the way children interact with their environment, that they don't automatically exploit their environment or want to extract things from it. They're fascinated by it. They're wondering about it. And young children sometimes we live in a city and we go, well, there's no environment here. We need to go, up the coast to Maine or something. But young children can go outside and be fascinated with this little ant that's just crawling around. And so one of the things I think early childhood educators become so good at is to see the world through the eyes at the height of very young children. And I think that's at the root of a very different kind of relationship we have with our environment and with our climate.
Yes. Lindsay, you do study kind of how kids relate to their environment and also kind of how best to communicate to families, but also to children directly, kind of science and evidence-based. Kind of facts and narratives about our environment, including, as relates to climate change. Can you just share a little bit about your work here? I know at a different part of Harvard, and kind of what you've learned, and kind of what you found to be most resonant for families, and hopefully empowering and not despairing when it comes to the conversation around early childhood and climate change.
So, in young children, and when we mean young children, we mean really young, like the prenatal period and even earlier, like preconception. Our biological systems, the brain, but it's also bigger than the brain, right? It's the metabolic system, the immune system. They're all developing in this deeply interconnected way, and they're influenced by the environments that surround them. And this is where climate change comes in again, because, like I talked about earlier, it's sort of impacting and affecting these environments that surround children that shape their development. And there's a lot of really good research that's out there that's done by people, not myself, at other places like Gaurav Center and others, that have seen in three big categories, how climate change is starting to impact those deeply interconnected biological systems. And it sort of boils down to three big categories, right? It's really air, temperature, and water. And we can tell, now we know these biological pathways, things like how higher temperatures are leading to babies being born too early or too small. And this audience, very well understands the implications that can have across the life course. And I think that science is really important. And I also think that some of the most compelling science is the kind that our grandmothers could have explained to us. And that becomes really valuable when we're trying to build understanding and meaning around early childhood and climate. So, I can give some examples, but if you think about sharing a book with a toddler, and you have that toddler and it's a warm summer day and you're in a small room and it's very hot and there's not a lot of air circulation. And you can imagine how you might feel while you try to share that book, and how that toddler might feel, and how that environment might impact their behavior. And then you take that same toddler and the same book on the same day, but you go out and you're in a grassy field and you're on a blanket under a tree and there's a breeze blowing. That environment is very different, and it's going to shape our experiences. And then, you can imagine something more acute. Like there's an extreme wet weather event and there aren't flood diversions in your neighborhood. And so your home floods and you and your children need to leave for a month. And then that same extreme wet weather event happens, but now you live in a neighborhood where there's porous pavement that can absorb a lot of the excess water and the storm runoff. And there's bioswales that can accommodate the sewer overflows. And your home doesn't flood and you don't have to leave. And so I think these are some of the connections we can make about how fundamentally climate change is affecting these exposures and these experiences that are surrounding children as they develop. And there's just a few. We can get into a lot more, but I think that that's really our unique role that a lot of us in the room, in terms of like things that we can all go out and do today, we understand these connections. We're here, you're here because you understand that relationships and environments really matter. And so I think starting to connect some of these dots can be a really powerful way to kind of build that understanding.
And Lindsay, one of the things that I know we've talked about before is kind of what are the adaptations that we need? Because I will say, parenthetically, I find it quite challenging when kind of the knee-jerk reaction sometimes from policymakers is like, well, just people are going to have to move. Like, maybe. Or see porous concrete. The blithe ways in which sometimes people talk about people's lives and livelihoods, but also people's homes and domiciles, I find challenging in this conversation often. And yet, of course, we do know that tens of millions of people are moving because of climate change. And Cora, because Lindsay just referenced your work, I wonder if you could talk about kind of your current kind of research and kind of what you're really focused on, and also, again, kind of what solutions you see as really having kind of meaningfully protective effect for kids and families.
Well, again, Lindsay and I are trying to bring this health lens to this work. And so maybe you could start with saying, why talk about it at health? Climate change has many issues at once. Why is it important to talk about the impacts of health? To care for people's health is to honor people's humanity, to honor the vulnerability of their lives. Again, it gets into this, frankly, sacred space of how you care for one another. And I think, study after study has shown that explaining the health impacts of climate solutions, let's talk about benefits, how many health benefits you can improve at one time with stopping fossil fuels is extraordinary. We could look at how dire it is of how much harm it's doing. 1 out of 5 premature deaths around the world because of air pollution. Tens of thousands of people dying in a heat wave in Europe, recent summer heat waves. So the numbers are frankly astounding. And we can take the path, like Chelsea had said, say we're going to make a different kind of world. We are going to save so many lives. We're going to make people's health so much better by stopping fossil fuels, which we don't need, which we have better solutions. We have better clean energy. We don't need it. And we're going to have to tackle the power dynamics and the political implications of all that. But, what for health for me, the reason it's important to talk about health also, Lindsay and I, pore over the public health data. The data is very important. We have a bunch of graphs in our slide decks. But I'll go back to Chelsea. What you were talking about is the storytelling is critical here. And I think what studies have shown, again, is if we are talking about action, if we are going to make people move on this, when people are talking about climate change and the solutions that we need to bring to bear, we need to present the data clearly, but I want them to be picturing a child. I want them to be picturing it in their eyes, realizing that that is the heart of the conversation. And what study has shown overall is if we can pair health messaging with the storytelling, that is how you make action happen. And so, the solutions are everywhere. For schools, again, I'm really conscious of not putting more work onto an overburdened group of people who are working so hard to care for our children and educate our children. But schools are an opportunity to be an epicenter of climate solutions. And the solutions will provide support for all the things that educators want. Again, climate solutions improve childhood mental health, behavioral regulation, sleep patterns, reproductive health outcomes. So it's not your job to do this. We need people to come in and help put in the heat pumps, to green our playgrounds. 18 million children go to school in a heat island. That means the school is hotter than their neighboring community. And so we can picture the child being flush and running around on a hot asphalt and then taking a test. And by the way, on a very hot day, there's a 12% higher chance of a failure rate on a test. Every 1% increase of temperature decreases by 1%, test score failure rates. These are the 5% of the racial achievement gap can be attributed to heat by itself. I've seen a number as high as 13. Can you believe that all these things that we care about in health and in education can be addressed by an aggressive approach to climate change?
Leah, I see you nodding quite a lot. Could you just share a little bit more, as you kind of indicated earlier, kind of not only kind of why this is now such a focus of kind of your work on behalf of Black children and families in our country. I think that's well understood, but kind of what you're focused on. And maybe also, Candidly, because you are in kind of a different organization than our fellow panelists here, from different parts of Harvard, how could people get involved in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I did note, I am the only person not directly connected to Harvard on this panel. Oh, thank you. I don't know why you clapped, but I'll take that. That's awesome. One thing I do want to just pick up on is the data and sort of the analysis that you both provided, right? And so if we think about a child who is in a school, and we know that for many Black students and low-income students, they're in schools that are, in fact, hotter, that don't have the resources. Literally, many are in schools that don't have air conditioning and ventilation systems that allow them to be in a comfortable temperature, right? So if we think about that's your reality and how that might change your behavior. And so, yes, there's the correlation to your academic achievement, and if you fail a test that day or pass it, less about what you know, but more about everything you're experiencing. We also know that your behavior may change, right? So just imagine on a very hot day when you're just agitated and someone's too close to you and you kind of want to smack them, but you can't because that's, not allowed. But it might happen in a school, right? And so for a Black child, more than likely than any other child, all of this context isn't going to matter. It's going to be, oh, you are a bad kid, and so now you are suspended. You are then expelled, and it starts off as young as 3 and 4 years old. So it's not just elementary, middle, and high school. Excuse me, we're literally talking about little kids who that's an impact of climate change that's happening to them in their classrooms as young as 3 and 4 years old. So just wanted to kind of add to the data you all presented and show how these discrepancies and these inequities really show up for Black children in ways that we don't always connect the dots on. And then our work, so the National Black Child Development Institute is a national organization. We've actually been around for over 50 years. We are, as the name suggests, focused on the development of Black children. We have 8 essential outcomes that we have created sort of a framework for a healthy and thriving and joyful. I always want to add joyful into this because we don't tend to allow Black children to just actually be joyful. We're so busy trying to create these little adults that just allowing them to be and be happy and joyful has become an essential part of our work. So I'm actually going to read the 8 essential outcomes to you for a number of reasons. One, they're that important to me to make sure I get them right each time. And 2, we did a lot of work to make sure they were written from the voice of a child. I love the story of kids. It's not even a story, the fact of children seeing the world literally from a different vantage point. And I can remember being a kindergarten teacher and sitting in the seat that they would sit in, and other adults would be like, why are you sitting in the kid's seat? And I'm like, you don't understand what I see down here. It's a whole different experience. But our 8 essential outcomes. So we envision a world in which every Black child is born at a healthy weight, attends a school that affirms and expands them, enjoys meals with vegetables, and as the mother of a 9-year-old, that is not easy, hangs out on a safe and appropriate internet, has books and toys that reflect who they are and who they can be, breathes clean air and drinks clean water, is seen as a child, and lives and plays in a safe community. And so our work is all grounded in hopefully one day seeing these outcomes come to fruition. As a national organization, we are in many ways kind of a research and think tank institute. We bring ideas to bear. And then we have a national affiliate network of over 24 community-based organizations that are advocating and in some cases implementing programs to bring these 8 outcomes to fruition in their communities. But what we've realized, especially as we are in these conversations with the climate experts, is that quite frankly, each one of those 8 outcomes will be completely disrupted by climate change if we're not aggressively centering children in the climate work that we're seeking to do. And so that's how we have now come to a place where this is such an important issue for us, and we are really supporting our affiliate network with the resources, the tools, the research they need to do their advocacy on the local level.
Julie, I see that you brought a prop. Though I feel like maybe that's, I'm accidentally, inadvertently not giving the great Rachel Carson her due. But I have to ask, why did you bring Rachel Carson's book on stage with you, and what should we know about both it and your why?
I love it.
So every time I try to think about the intersection of early childhood and environmental issues, I reread this very small book. It's from Rachel Carson, and for those of you who don't know, Rachel Carson is one of the most important advocates that changed the data, the science, and the stories that we tell about climate. But what many of you probably don't know, what I didn't know until about 10 years ago, the last unfinished book that Rachel Carson wrote was about the intersection of early childhood and climate change. She, towards the end of her life, she became the guardian of her nephew. And so after her lifetime worth of work, she started to act like an early childhood educator. She started to see the world, see environment and climate through the eyes of the child. And if you don't mind, I want to read just a short passage from Carson's book.
I mean, I feel like it's very appropriate that we have story time in early childhood and climate.
It was probably the most beautiful description of young children and the environment that I've seen, and it's from Carson. I'm going to take my glasses off. So, a child's world is fresh and new and beautiful, full of wonder and excitement. It is our misfortune that for most of us, that clear-eyed vision, that true instinct for what is beautiful and awe-inspiring is dimmed or even lost before we reach adulthood. If I had influence with the good fairy who's supposed to preside over the christening of all children, I should ask that her gift to each child in the world be a sense of wonder so indestructible that it could last throughout life. That is what you talked about, the joy and seeing the child as a child. If a child is to keep alive their inborn sense of wonder without any such gifts from fairies, he needs the companionship of at least one adult, the parent, the child care provider, the educator, who can share it, rediscovering with the child the joy, the excitement, and the mystery of the world we live in.
Gisele, how did you find this book 10 years ago, or how did it find you?
Well, at the time, actually, we were collaborating with Patty and Too Small to Fail, and we were thinking about all sorts of issues. And I was working in Pittsburgh. And there were two important pioneers who were born in Pittsburgh who were deeply affected by the climate before we even started to talk about climate change. One is Fred Rogers, who grew up in an industrial town, who was so sick from all the pollutants in the town that he was cornered in his closet with one of the few air conditioners trying to get through his childhood. And it was in that loneliness that he started to play with puppets, which come to what we know as Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. And meanwhile, across the river, Rachel Carson was growing up on a small farmstead, which she absolutely loved. It was beautiful. But the pollution of the steel mills of Pittsburgh gradually destroyed the homestead she loved. And that was the root of how she became the kind of advocate that she was. And so at the time, and we were trying to think about the intersection of early childhood and the environment, it was so natural to look into the childhood and the history of these two great advocates and how their ideas meet in the middle. Right, meet in the middle, and which is very much the title of Carson's unfinished book, The Sense of Wonder. How our care, our actions can be inspired, not just by the sense of risk and impending threat, but the sense of wonder that children have about the world around them.
And what we can learn from them. I know we'd hoped to take questions from the audience. I think there are people walking around with note cards. Yes. So please, if you have questions for our extraordinary panelists, I think you can take a note card, or if you already have a note card, you can return it, and hopefully we'll get to your questions. Lindsay, I do want to kind of come back to you because you kind of referenced other things that we could talk about in one of your earlier comments. And so I wonder kind of what have we not talked about yet from a kind of research and science perspective, kind of as we think about kind of climate change and health, either on the kind of challenges or the solutions that you'd like kind of to shed light on in this conversation?
Oh, thanks for the question. I think Gaurav brought up a really important point thinking about temperature, and that's something that we've been thinking about at our center a lot. And I'd love to expand it a little bit because I think it points to a solution space that maybe a lot of us in the room are positioned to act on. And you and I love to talk about solutions together, so we should get there. Heat impacts children's development in a variety of ways. And I think we can think about solutions at 3 levels. And at each of those 3 levels, there's so many options, no matter where we sit, where we can act. I think first is thinking about immediately addressing harms from extreme heat events and thinking about things like how do we keep pregnant people and very young children, infants, toddlers, safe during heat events, thinking about things like cooling centers and how can we use places that we already have that are available and accessible to help keep people safe when these events happen. And then thinking about, second, how can we adapt And how can we ask for adaptations to our current systems, infrastructures, the places, thinking about where are pregnant people and really little babies spending their time? And how can we adapt those places to withstand the fact that we know that temperatures are going to stay higher than they've ever been before? And this can look like things like thinking about how to get some of the heat technologies that you talked about into schools. How do we think about geothermal heat pumps and other technologies that can make early care and education and elementary schools cooler? And then third is thinking about how do we address the cause of why the planet is warming? And this can, look like things like accessing solar technologies and decreasing our reliance on the energy grid. And the two big categories that can fit into all three of those levels that I really love for us to think about in this space that you brought up and that you've done so much work in with Too Small to Fail is at greening the places where pregnant people and little children spend their time. This is such a powerful intervention, and I think that it really deserves a spotlight because, there's so many reasons, but my new favorite one, and you just brought this to the forefront of my thinking, and I thank you for that, is just that all children deserve this sense of wonder and curiosity and being able to do what I did and what my children did, being in the dirt with a stick, right? And just that joy that it brings. And we can list all of the benefits that it has on their physical health, on their microbiome, on their immune system. And we talked about the improvements and, it would help, 6 out of your 8 outcomes, in terms of children's mental health and, really innovative improvements we've seen from greening school years and how that translates to behavior in the classroom. And then the second bucket of interventions that I really love that's very closely related to greening schoolyards is this idea of smart surfaces. And this is sort of a category of interventions. It includes green space, but it's a lot of other things. Our traditional buildings, whether they're early care and education centers or schools, especially in northern climates like ours, are designed to keep heat in. And our sidewalks and our pavements and our schoolyards, they reflect heat and they make temperatures warmer. And so smart surfaces are things like porous pavements that I referenced earlier that can help to, instead of reflecting heat and making temperatures higher, actually absorb water and reduce storm runoff that can then contaminate water and lead to unclean drinking water for many, many children. This is still a problem. Bioswales that can contain and manage storm runoff. And then really interesting things like thinking about how do we make cool or reflective or green roofs, and how do we bring those to early care and education and school settings? Because if you can lower the temperature in the building where a young baby spends their time, that will improve their sleep. And sleep is like the glue that holds us all together, right? It's one of the pillars of our health. And so if we can improve that, this is another one of those places where I think connecting the dots to the solution space is really powerful, because I don't think that there's a complete understanding yet in the world about how when you make an infant sleep better, you make them a happier, more curious learner with better behavior, with better physical health. And those outcomes are true for children, but they're also true for the adults that they become. And so it's not just learning, and it's not just mental health, and it's not just physical health, but it's social emotional development, and it's happiness and the ability to be a thriving person across your lifespan. So I think that, it's starting small with building the understanding, but I think that in general, naming and explaining to people in positions who make these decisions why these solutions are so powerful and how accessible actually they really are, like many of them are right there. I think that that's something that we can all do today.
I see all of you nodding. So I wonder, Leah, if we can also just now turn to you to ask, how do you think we can best ensure that Black children are centered in the solutions that Lindsay just spoke to, that kind of true kind of health equity, climate equity is designed from the beginning into these kind of interventions at a school level, but also at a national level?
Yeah, it's a big, challenging question. I think we've gotten to a point where we understand the importance of centering those most impacted. We're aware that that is important. I think that what we have to begin to do, though, is understand that centering that looks like a testimonial. Centering that looks like re-traumatizing someone where they're saying over and over again how bad things are is not centering. That it's about learning from and listening to. It's about being guided by those most impacted. It's recognizing that those folks have expertise, experience, solutions. Even if they don't have solutions, they have ideas. They have ways in which that we have for generations and generations somehow, quite frankly, made it work to a certain extent in a place that didn't really want us or brought us here for a very specific reason. And so I think that really embracing Black and brown people as valuable and necessary to idea generation, implementation, and evaluation of solutions is really critical. And that's a shift in power dynamics that sometimes centering can just sound really nice, like, okay, well, I invited you to the table and you said something. But really changing or shifting that power dynamic where you are now you're the expert, and I'm coming to you to understand your point of view and your perspective and your ideas. And I always kind of say this as I was a former funder, so I feel like I can have a love-hate relationship there. It's also investing in those same people. So again, like, don't just, invite to the table and say that was nice to hear, but what is the true investment of resources, financial resources, and it's not all just a money issue, but what does it look like to really invest in the wisdom and the expertise of Black and brown folks?
It also, I think, too, Leah, I think Lindsay earlier was saying how thankfully at Too Small to Fail and other work that we've done, that we do center kind of parents and other caregivers, because I think often too in these conversations, parents and caregivers have not been included, and I think certainly painfully it is true that Black parents and caregivers have been particularly excluded historically. I wonder, similarly to you, Gaurav, what other kind of work that you're doing kind of on kind of the inquiry front or the kind of, talking about solutions front would you like to bring into this conversation that we haven't, touched on yet, whether it relates to heat or anything else?
What I would say, I'm very worried about the mental health crisis that's coming, that is here among children who are worried about the climate crisis. And we're living in this kind of, for me, it's disorienting that never before have we seen the impacts of climate change just ravage us. And I'm an optimistic person, but I'm really worried. There's real peril everywhere. And never before have we lived at a moment where the climate solutions are here to bear fruit. And we have to, you said it, Chelsea, we are living in a moment where our actions will have extraordinary implications for generations to come. And we have to embrace that deep work. We have to embrace this, that we're obviously living in extraordinary times in many ways. There's a bigness to this time. There's a complexity to this time. And I think it's really important to, as climate change feels so complicated, there's so many layers, we literally need to remake the world. That is actually true. We have to rebuild everything with health and justice at the core of it. And we didn't do a good job of that the last 50 years. And here's the thing, we know how to do that. I want to make sure everyone understands we have everything we need to tackle this head on. We waited way too long. We should have had this conversation decades that we should be 20 years, ago, be doing what we're doing right now. We waited too long, and there's great harm, and there will be harm around the world. As a global health person, those are the pictures, the migration, the food insecurity, the water scarcity. Those are the first things that come to my mind. And even still, so there's no winning climate change. We haven't talked about the Inflation Reduction Act yet. That was a very, very big deal. Okay, by one federal policy, it's modeled out. The U.S. is committed to a 50% reduction by 2030 in emissions and anthropogenic emissions by 2050. The Inflation Reduction Act promises to get 40% of that, almost all of it. And you throw in state-based policies that are happening everywhere. The ingenuity, you know, Lindsay, the comments that she was making about like the creative solutions that we have, it is all there. 82% of all new energy installations in 2021 were clean energy. I mean, there is transformation happening everywhere, in the United States and around the world. There's a momentum that is here, that is unstoppable. And so, listen, I stay up, I'm a worrier, I stay up late at night worry, and that's how it is. So I'm worried, not worried. But we have it all. It's all here. And the work is what Lindsay is saying, to see the humanity of every child, to bring in the right community participatory work, to have the values right, and to say that every piece of what we do in creating society, like I don't think about emissions or pollutants that much. Like those are measurements, those are manifestations of what we are creating. We didn't create the right things, so we ended up in this crisis. We've got to get to that deeper work of that, and it's hard. I am not, it's not. We are built with a sense of wonder. Like we gotta embrace our human connectivity, our ability to see each other's humanity is ours. We were built that way. And we're talking about children here, we're goofing around about our children before here and the stories, you know, they bring home to us. I believe in human beings, you know, and obviously we're in the throes of reckoning with racial justice, reckoning with the ways that we build this more fair world. And this is just all part of that. But it's that I am not worried about the technology. I am not, you know, we've got to implement with breakneck pace, but I just hope people know we've got everything we need to do this.
Well, and I think, you were making the point earlier about how powerful stories are to hopefully bring people into this conversation who aren't in this room, you know, this evening. Because I do think, you know, sometimes when we think about either the large-scale challenges, whether kind of emissions or the rising temperature, or even the large-scale solutions like the Inflation Reduction Act, it can feel very sort of distal to people. And yet, when we talk about, you know, the number of people who died in the European heat waves, or the fact that because of rising temperatures, the kind of sphere of people who are at risk for malaria, you know, goes 3 miles north every year across the continent of Africa. Or that we had malaria in Florida. Mm-hmm. This is less distal. Right? This is more tangible. I think it's more easy than for people to think that could be me, that could be my family, that could be my child. And so I do think the importance of storytelling is so crucial, both to help people understand the vulnerabilities, but also the solutions. And so, Julie, I want to turn to you, who has been such a good storyteller, talking about kind of Mr. Rogers and kind of sharing the words of Rachel Carson and connecting us all back to Pittsburgh. Just again, a similar question. What stories do you think we haven't kind of paid enough attention to in this conversation this evening, or what kind of hard evidence on kind of challenges or solutions have we not yet focused on?
Mm-hmm. So I'm not a policymaker, but I think a lot about the principles that upon which we build our policies, or upon which we try to develop technical solutions. And so I think back to the work of early childhood, whether it's someone doing it on television or whether it is someone doing it on the floor with children. Two particular principles that come to mind as I was listening to all of you, that is as much true for early childhood work as it is true for this climate work. One is this idea that, and my colleagues here in this school would often say, that we cannot make a lasting impact on children by skipping over the adults in the middle. Right? And that would mean the families, that would mean the care providers, that would mean the educators, whether it is about including them, whether it is about understanding how we can support them, that if we can create disaster response or protective buffers around the adults, children's sense of wonder will be overwhelmed by the sense of fear and concern that they feel in the adults. This is as true as, when a mother is holding a child without saying a word, the stress that the mother feels will be felt at the child level. Right? And so whatever policies that we develop, that it's easy sometimes politically to talk about, let's do it for the children. No, let's do it for the adults who are around the children so the adults can do what they do for the children. The other principle that seemed to emerge here, and I think this is a challenge, this is a welcoming challenge for the early childhood field too, which is to think, what is health? Right? We've talked here about physical health, we've talked here about mental health, behavioral health, and so on. But increasingly, I think the field start to understand that the foundation of all these things we call health and well-being is relational health. We know this very well in early childhood, that the thriving of even someone as young as an infant dependent on the health of the relationship that infant have. And if we think about a family, the health and well-being of a family depended on their relationships with their community and with their world. And the health of a community depend on their relationships with the environment all around them, which is what we have been talking tonight. And I think to expand that framework, the one relationship now we need to consider in every aspect of this work is the relationship we have with our environment, whether we're thinking about a child, a family, or a community, and that the relationship with the environment is part of that relational health too. And that relational health ultimately becomes the foundation for everything that we value in the lives of children and families and communities.
And I think too, Junli, just building on that, all of the recent evidence about how few relationships actually adults have in our country now versus even 20 years ago, and certainly juxtaposed generations ago, I think is just so well said that we have to have relational help in all of these conversations, whether we are kind of talking about kind of public health and well-being, or the environment. And while you were talking, I was thinking about how lucky I was, but also am, that I spent a lot of time in national parks as a kid. And in state parks in Arkansas, but that so many of my earliest family memories are at Dinosaur National Park or Glacier National Park or in the Blue Ridge Mountains or at Pinnacle State Park in Arkansas, and how grateful I am that my parents understood kind of that I needed that sense of wonder. And so I'm going to call them tonight and say thank you. Because I think it's important that we kind of live in gratitude too, in a moment of deep kind of fear and dislocation. And one of the things that we've not talked about this evening, and I really, I'm curious kind of what thoughts you have, and also hope that whomever's collecting the cards can bring them to me so that while I can keep asking questions, I want to, ensure that the audience can also have questions asked through my voice, if that's not odd, is kind of for any parents or grandparents or aunts or uncles or older siblings or just anyone here who has a little kid in their lives that they care about, what advice would you have for them as kind of you think about your kind of position as parents, but also as researchers, as advocates? Kind of what do you think kind of those of us who have small humans in our lives should know maybe that we haven't talked about, or any advice that you might have for them? Lindsay, I'm looking at you.
Yeah,
Yeah, you can go first.
I'm closest. I'll go first. I'm going to steal something that you said in the green room that I don't think is a prepared comment, but really struck me, that like when we all feel this sort of overwhelm, how important it is at our core to just connect with the young children in our lives and to see them for what they are, as like full of wonder and full of innocence. And I think of that story you told of your little child grabbing your face and saying it's going to be okay. And it's just so beautiful, right? Because you can get very much, several people have talked about this, caught up in it. And I think, you know, I'm sort of tired of telling people to do more things. You know, I don't want them to tell them, you know, you need to go out and now fix climate change too. And so I think just saying it's okay to go home and connect and celebrate and love the young children in your life, because it's such a gift, right? If you have a young child in your life, that whatever your relationship to them, I think that that's such a special thing that we can't lose that celebration of that relationship that's sort of at the core of all of these other things, and have it be lost amidst all these bigger worries. So I think that's what I hold tight when I start to feel very worried, and I think it can just be a source of both like comfort and celebration.
Yeah.
Ditto. I mean, in all seriousness.
And it's Goran's idea, so we can just
ditto on both sides. No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we want to avoid as much as we can the climate kind of anxiety that is a very real issue and struggle for folks. And so, yeah, this like idea of enjoying and being joyful with young people and learning from them really resonates with me. I think the other thing is to help parents in particular understand sort of the ecosystem in which you are participating. And it's like, what are the things you can do with your child or children at home? We were talking about like early childhood providers, no matter what size space they have, they make use of that space in some really miraculous and wondrous ways. And so how can you be doing that at home? And then kind of building from there. You know, we're really big on how do we help parents, in particular educators, understand the responsibilities that are outside of them. Like, you don't have to take on everything. There are systems and there are industries that we have to figure out how we hold folks accountable for what they do to us as well. It's not as easy, but I think there's something, we also have to help parents in that sense as well.
So there are a lot of questions, but most of them relate to two areas. One really is kind of the question around climate anxiety, and what more can we be doing to help support children, but also particularly a lot of questions around educators, early childhood educators, but also kind of school age children, educators, to navigate supporting kids, navigating climate anxiety, but also their own anxiety. And then another kind of whole bucket of questions around, and I know, Julie, you said you're not a policymaker, but a lot of questions around how do we try to get policymakers to act at the local, state, and federal level. And so just kind of want to put those two questions here and ask each of you, to offer thoughts in reaction to either or both. I will say, when I think about kind of kids and anxiety and climate change, I think it is, of course, largely driven by the fact that climate change is real and getting worse, and we haven't done enough, Gaurav, to your point, to try to ameliorate it or stop it. I think it's also partly driven by the fact that we have a lot of adults looking to kids and saying, how great is it that you're going to solve this? Yeah. Which I find completely unacceptable as an adult. That we look at kids and we're like, oh, how great is it that you're going to solve this? Or like, we don't have to worry about it because you're going to solve it. No. No. Like, they are children. We are the adults. We don't get to abrogate our responsibilities just because we couldn't be responsible yet. So I do think it is a real challenge in many areas, but particularly when it comes to climate change, because we do have extraordinary young climate activists who are trying to hold us accountable, but somehow we think they're trying to hold us accountable means that only they are accountable. And they should be going to school and playing outside in the dirt and having a sense of wonder. We should hold ourselves accountable that we have failed to do that for them. I'm going to get off my soapbox now to our panelists so that they can tell us, how do we motivate our politicians to hopefully behave like adults and respond to the action as it relates to climate change? And how do we help better protect and promote kind of mental health and well-being with all of the climate anxiety that young people and educators of young people feel?
Could I say something? I think we haven't really spotlighted the vast problem of misinformation, and just how much bad information that children are getting all over the place. And frankly, there's a lot of corrupt interests trying to do that. For a long time, it was about, no, fossil fuels are okay. And now a weird thing is, you were talking about the covers, right? And it is very true that if you stimulate despair, there's people out there stimulating despair, which is paralyzing people from progress. And so there's malicious actors out there. That's just real. And again, I think the theme of what we're all talking and what I know brought everyone to this room today is, in spite of the huge challenges of all that stuff, all that ugly stuff, the like moral power of the love of child, I think is the most powerful thing in the world, and we need to embrace the power of that moral anchoring, and so how do we get people to move? We were not, climate change was not on the landscape of federal policy, it was not brought up in presidential debate, and it became one of the most activating issues in 2020, right? It was a big voting issue. So things have changed. I told you 2018 is when I started this. Things have changed a lot, and I credit the youth movement and how much they did. And in addition to your point, Chelsea, that we cannot be leaning on these young kids to do these rallies. But I think that we have to combat a lot of that. Some of my work, we're teaching and studying how to help people become advocates, effective advocates. And the term that is coming to the forefront over and over, is well studied now also, is self-efficacy. People have to feel a sense of agency, that there are big and hard things. The world has frankly always been a very hard place, where there's been a lot of pain and suffering around the world in the course of our lifetimes. There's been massive progress on many global health fronts. So we can do big things. And all of the history of humans has been tackling really hard things. And this is another story of that. But the zone has been flooded with all this bad information. And if we can cultivate community, I think community is critical, declaring our values, finding our people, finding leadership structures so that we can come together and find our voice and sense of self-efficacy, that's the space where I think profound change happens.
Anyone else want to comment on either question?
Well, I think in part, the antidote or the counterpart to anxiety and climate overwhelm in young children is showing them the solutions. Right? And not saying you're responsible for the solutions, but the same way they're getting messages of, things are so dire and the planet is warming and things are being so terrible. We need to counteract that and balance that with examples of people in their context, in their communities, in their lives, because those people are going out and making things better. Local leadership is engaged, and people are doing amazing things all over our country. And so, if we can amplify that and show children what that looks like, I think that that's a really powerful kind of antidote to that feeling of it's so big and so heavy and I can't tackle it. And I think, I have not as much experience with policymakers as somebody like Gaurav, but in my experience, the thing that often unlocks things for people who are in positions of power is having that connection to understanding how it impacts someone that they love, right? When you make that connection about how this will affect their grandchild, their niece, their little neighbor that they love, it suddenly doesn't become about polar bears, right? It becomes about that child, and people want to protect children. There are people out there who don't love young children, but there's many, many more that do. And so I think that that possibility to tap that and to connect on that level is really powerful.
And that we just have to keep going.
Yeah.
Right? I wonder, Leah or Junli, if you have any thoughts or reflections about the two big questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Just two quick shout outs of two projects that our organization is involved in. One is the Early Years Climate Action Task Force, which published a paper in the sort of winter of 2023, last year, that lays out really nicely recommendations for policymakers at the federal level, state level, local level. We did a lot of work of figuring out how to support early childhood providers without, quite frankly, we could say climate anxiety. It's getting late, so just driving them crazy, right? Like giving them some suggestions that don't feel like one more thing to do. So I would recommend that you go to, the website is CAPITA, C-A-P-T-I-A, and you can get the report there and see that. And then the second project I'll name is a project that is called Black Representation for Kids. And it is all about ensuring that, as we're talking about storytelling, ensuring that books and resources that are tackling or introducing climate change to Black and brown communities actually have Black and brown people in those resources. And so kids can see a community, a neighborhood that looks like theirs, both from a standpoint of the impact, but also from a standpoint of you as an expert, you as an advocate, and how you can be a part of the change we seek.
I think we cannot address the climate challenge with only technical solutions, that we would need relational solutions, because we are where we are because of a broken relationship that we have with the environment around us. So when all of us in the green room as well as here keeps thinking and talking about our own children as well as our own childhood. And so I'm just thinking, like, if you can think of a child in your life right now, right? And you picture in 10 years, in 20 years, and you wonder, what kind of relationship do you want them to have with the world around them? It's surely not a relationship of consumption and exploitation the way it has been, but it is also not a relationship that's built on fear and helplessness or cynicism. That our hope is that they would, in their 20s, in their 30s, when they become parents, that they have a relationship that's fundamentally based on that sense of wonder that young children have about that world. And that out of that sense of wonder, when you wonder about something, when you wonder about a tree, an ant, a person, you care about that thing that you're wondering about. And if you care about that thing, then you take action for it. And I think that's the kind of relational solution, in addition to the technical solutions that we need as we look ahead to the times we have.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on. A sense of wonder, and also the humility of all we still have to learn, but also the confidence of all that we do know. And the urgency to continue to ask better questions, but also to be mindful of the solutions that exist. Thanks to many of the people in this room, and certainly the people on this stage this evening. I want to acknowledge that we had many more questions on cards on many critical issues. I know on kind of migration, certainly at a global standing on kind of global health matters, and certainly hope that you will find these extraordinary people kind of here, for those of you who are at Harvard, but I certainly hope that panels like this always include those who are outside the ivory tower. Leah, thank you so much for being with us and kind of talking about kind of your work of kind of bringing research kind of into advocacy and action and accountability, and words that don't start with A. That awkward alliteration. Thank you.
Keep it going.
Yeah, it's always good to be with fellow nerds, and also citizens. And I know I'm not kind of the official closer this evening, and want to ask, I believe, Laura to come up and do the honors. But it would be awkward for me to not acknowledge that we're in an election year. And while I certainly have early memories of going to national parks with my parents, I already took all of you down memory lane with me. I also have early memories of going to vote with my parents. I take my kids to vote. Please take your kids to vote, particularly if they care about climate change. Because who is in office at the local, state, and federal level in our country, as you heard this evening, really matters. There's a lot of attention on the presidential election for understandable reasons. But whomever is in the White House has nothing to do with the pavement that is here in Cambridge. They're not going to make decisions about what's going to happen to the public school roofs. They're not going to be allocating kind of budget dollars as to whether or not there should be more or fewer green spaces. If you care about the climate, of course it matters who's in the White House and Congress. You heard Gaurav talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, the single largest investment in green infrastructure in the history of the world ever. But it matters who's in local office too. So I won't tell you who to vote for, but I will tell you, since I have the microphone, to please take your kids to vote with you so they understand the connection between what they care about, whether it's climate or education or health or all of the above and how they intersect, and who you pull the lever for and why you pull the lever in the first place and why you choose to vote and participate in our democracy, hopefully, so that we can keep it. Please join me in just thanking our extraordinary panelists and in welcoming Laura to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Just wow, that was an incredible conversation. I just would like to say another big thank you to our panelists, to Dean Long and Chelsea Clinton for an excellent conversation tonight about such a critical issue. For those that don't know me, my name's Laura Shifter. I have the great honor and privilege of being both a senior fellow at the Aspen Institute and a faculty member here at Harvard, where we've been able to start leading conversations around what it means to be preparing educators to be education leaders in a changing climate. And we would encourage you all to stay with us on this journey. There's a lot of conversation about how we have the solutions that we need, but we haven't mobilized to enact them yet. That's where education comes in. So everybody has a role to play in doing this. I also have to say one of my most important roles that I have is as a mom. And I know, like many people have felt when they look at their children, from the moment I held my eldest daughter in my arms, I wanted her to be healthy, to be happy, and to be safe. Climate change puts all of those things at risk for children everywhere. But we all have the opportunity to advance solutions, and we don't need to be a climate scientist to do it. A very famous climate scientist, Katherine Hayhoe, says one of the biggest things that you can do about it is start talking about it. So as a homework assignment, because we're at the ed school, I would like you all to reflect on one thing that you heard tonight and go and talk to somebody about it. That's all you've got to do, is to try and help build awareness on this issue, build awareness on the importance of it, and let everybody know that there is something that they can do to contribute to solutions. So thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you again to this wonderful panel, and continue to stay with us on our journey. So.